Chris Fitzgerald, and welcome to part 2 of the Walking Bassline series. In the first video in the series, entitled Introduction to Walking Basslines, we covered the concepts of target notes and approach notes and focused largely on the changes to the Charlie Parker's conformation. And the changes to that tune are largely constructed out of a harmonic rhythm which moves at 2 chords per bar for the most part. And when a chord progression moves at 2 chords per bar, conceiving of a walking bassline using target notes and approach notes is a very simple thing for the bassist because there's not that many choices to make. There is a target note that you're trying to get to and an approach note that you play to lead into the target note. And when it's 2 chords per bar, all the bassist really needs to think of is target, approach, target, approach, target, approach. Well, in this video, we're going to be dealing with a set of changes which has a longer harmonic rhythm, changes to All the Things You Are. And the harmonic rhythm for All the Things You Are is basically 1 chord per bar, and in several spots, there's 1 chord that lasts 2 bars. And so this type of chord motion leaves a lot more leeway for the bassist to make some decisions because there's more space between target notes for the bassist to fill. And so I like to approach discussing how to build basslines where we examine in a systematic way the different ways that a bassist might fill the space between target notes that are a little bit further apart. There are 2 basic global ways that a bassist can fill these spaces between target notes in a song like this. One is a linear or scalar approach in which the bassist plays what is basically stepwise. It sounds like taking 1 step at a time, basically musical steps, half steps and whole steps, to fill the space between the 2 target notes and build a line that way. Or there's a chordal or arpeggiated approach in which the bassist breaks up the notes of the chord tones, and breaks up the chord and skips from chord tone to chord tone, and then approaches the next target note. You may have noticed if you watched the introduction to this video that when I played a walking line on All the Things You Are, on the first 8 bars of the song, I used only the linear or scalar approach to connect the chord roots together. And on the second 8 bars, I used only the chordal arpeggiated approach to connect the 8 bars together. And so I'd like to begin our discussion of these types of basslines in that same order by talking about the scalar or linear approach first. Before we can really begin to discuss the linear scalar approach to connecting chord roots together, we have to cover some groundwork first, dealing with the different possibilities of how that connection might turn out. And the most obvious of these possibilities is we have to consider how far apart are the chord roots that we're trying to connect, because how far apart they are will determine how many steps there are between them and what we have to do in order to stay basically stepwise in connecting those 2 things together. There are 3 basic interval types that can exist between 2 chord roots. There is the interval of a second, as in C to D, or C to B, the interval of a third, as in C to E, or as in C down to A, or the interval of a fourth, as in C up to F, or C down to G. And each of these interval types presents a different set of challenges for us if we want to connect them in a stepwise fashion. We'll start with the interval of a second. If I'm trying to connect a chord root to another chord root that is a second apart, in other words, it's probably the next step up or down in the scale, with a 4-beat line connecting them, I'm obviously going to have to do some finagling and moving around in order to arrive at the next chord root at the right time. So if I'm trying to connect a C to a D, what I probably would need to do, one example of a way to do it, would be to backtrack below the C and then walk back up to the D. So basically C is on the downbeat of 1 measure, beat 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Or if I'm trying to connect the C to the B below it, I would probably have to move above the C and then walk back down to the B. Beat 1, 2, 3, again and play it in tune. Beat 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's the next target is the B. And that's an example of a way you might connect chord roots that are a second apart. When you have chord roots that are a third apart, you have a little bit more space between them, obviously. But still, if you were walking up or down a scale in order to connect those chord roots, you would pass your next target before you got to beat 1 of the next measure. And so you also have to think, how am I going to make this work? How am I going to get to the right place at the right time while still playing steps rather than largely skips in between these two chord roots? So one way that you might do that to connect the C to the E is to pass your target up and then to come back to it. So if I'm here on beat 1 of the first measure and I'm trying to get to here on beat 1 of the second measure, I might pass that E up and come back down to it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Likewise, if I were going C down to A, I could either go past it and come back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and there's the downbeat of the next chord root. Or I could go above it and then walk back down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And so that's how I might deal with the idea of connecting two chord roots that are a third apart. And we'll cover all of this later in a theory video and go into much more detail about different possibilities for that. But since our subject for today is the changes to all the things you are, and since the changes to all the things you are consist largely of chord roots which are a fourth or fifth apart, we'll spend some extra time on dealing with the idea of the interval of a fourth or a fifth. So when dealing with a fourth or a fifth, if I'm trying to go C up to F or C down to G, we're getting much closer to being able to actually walk from one chord root to the next. If I'm trying to connect this C to an F, and I have 4 beats to fill before I arrive at the F, basically I'm going to start walking, and then I'm going to make sure that I have the exact number of steps in between the first chord root and the second chord root, and it would go something like this. C, D, E flat, E, F, or beats 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. If I were going down to the G, it would be the same thing. If I just walk straight down the scale, I would get there too soon. 1, 2, 3, 4. But I really wanted to get there on beat 1 of the next measure, so I would insert a passing tone in between the A and the G in order to get there on time, and it would sound more like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. In All the Things You Are, like a lot of jazz standards, that chord root motion by fourth or fifth makes it really fertile ground for this sort of scalar linear approach to connecting bass lines. And so we're going to spend some time with this idea of fourths and fifths, and also the idea of whether we're walking up or walking down, because whether you're playing in a scalar fashion or in a chordal arpeggiated fashion, the idea of moving up or moving down becomes very important once you get a few bars into the progression, for reasons that we'll see in the next segment. The interval of the fourth/fifth is an incredibly important interval in jazz music, because so much of our music is built on progressions which rely heavily on this interval. Two of our most common progressions in standard jazz literature, the 2-5-1 progression and the turnaround 3-6-2-5-1, involve movements between chord roots which are a fourth or a fifth apart, depending on how you look at it. And we need to look at the fourth and the fifth as a special sort of interval, because the fourth inverts to the fifth. What that means is, if we start right now looking at the actual changes to All the Things You Are, if we look at the first 2 chords to All the Things You Are, the first 2 chords are F minor, and the second chord is B flat minor. So if we look at F minor and B flat minor, It's a perfect fourth if you go up from F to B flat, but it's a perfect fifth if you go F down to B flat. And when we're talking about making stepwise scalar connections between chord roots, we need to learn to deal with the fourth and fifth interval in a very special way, because it makes a big difference whether you are ascending or descending. As we'll see shortly, lines that are successful have to obviously do both, but it will be even more obvious after we do a certain example later on in this segment. But to start with, if we look at lines that are, we look at the distance from F to B flat, if we look at that interval as an ascending interval, it's an ascending fourth. And to build a line between F minor and B flat minor, anytime you have a scalar ascending fourth interval from, beat one of one measure to beat one of the second measure, you're going to have to insert a chromatic passing tone between, somewhere in that line between the F and the B flat, because if you just walk straight up the scale, you would get there too soon. You'd go beat 1, 2, 3, 4. I meant to get there on beat one of the next measure. So you insert a chromatic passing tone. And the most common way to insert that chromatic passing tone is as a double chromatic approach note to the next chord root. So you would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, which leads very, very strongly into the next chord root. And so chord tone wise, that would be root, second or ninth, flat third, major third, and then you've connected to the next root. Well, the chord qualities of the first 8 bars of all the things you are, we have 3 different types of chord qualities in that progression. The progression itself goes F minor, B flat minor, E flat 7, which is a dominant chord, A flat major, D flat major, G7, and C major. So we have major chords, minor chords, and dominant chords. But because of the nature of having to insert a chromatic passing tone in a line connecting those chord roots together, the most common bass line that you'll find probably in jazz history, in jazz bass history anyway, is this idea of a whole step followed by 2 half steps connecting to the next chord root. And the interesting thing about that is that it's the same line whether the chord is major, minor, or dominant. Because if it's minor, you're playing root, second, third, chromatic passing tone, and then the next root. If it's dominant, as it is in the E flat from the E flat to the A flat, you would go root, second, chromatic passing tone, major third, next root, E flat connecting to A flat. If you were connecting A flat to D flat, which is a major chord, you would be doing basically the same thing. Root, second, chromatic passing tone, third to D flat. And so that bass line, that sound of a whole step followed by several half steps leading into the next target note, the root of the next chord, is one of the most common sounds that you'll hear in all of jazz. My great friend and mentor, Len Seaton, once referred to this in a master class as the $1 million bass line, and he joked, first of all, that a jazz bass player is never going to make $1 million playing jazz. But if the bass player were going to make $1 million playing jazz, they would do it largely playing this bass line over and over and over, because it's so common and so clear, and it connects the chords so well together. So the ascending connection of, scalar connection of a fourth to an ascending of a one chord to another chord, an ascending fourth above it, can be accomplished by basically this $1 million bass line, no matter whether the chord is major, minor, or dominant, because a chromatic passing tone has to be inserted. And so it works from F to B flat, B flat to E flat, E flat to A flat, A flat to D flat, D flat to G, and G to C. Same bass line, the $1 million bass line. Now obviously, It's a great sound, and it's used all over jazz, and it's all over millions of recordings, jazz recordings throughout jazz history. But obviously you can't just play ascending lines all the time, or you would end up with lines that comically ended up sounding like this. So here's all the things you are using, probably one of the most common formulas in all of jazz bass, but only ascending. And obviously, there's not really too much, not really anywhere you can go from there but down. So that leads us to the idea of descending scalar connections, where that ascending fourth gets turned into a descending fifth. And when you're turning that ascending fourth into a descending fifth, because a fifth is one step wider than a fourth, F down to B flat is one step wider than a fourth. When you play a descending stepwise or scalar line connecting that fourth, you don't have to insert a chromatic passing tone, because all you have to do is walk down the scale from the one chord root to the next chord root, and it will automatically connect itself, because there are built in to the distance of a perfect fifth, there are 4 steps in between. So if I'm connecting F to B flat, I simply walk down the scale, B flat to E flat, E flat to A flat, A flat to D flat, D flat to G, G to C. So for descending lines of a descending fifth, which is the same distance on paper as an ascending fourth, I guess F to B flat can be seen as an ascending fourth or a descending fifth. For descending lines, you do not have to insert a chromatic passing tone. You can simply walk down the scale. For ascending lines, you need to insert a chromatic passing tone. But descending lines have the same problem as ascending lines, in that you can't just play descending lines or you'll run off the other end of the bass. Remember when we played the ascending line, we started here and we ran off the end of the fingerboard. If we start a descending line, we're going to end up at the bottom of the bottom string with nowhere to go. So if I play nothing but descending lines, connecting this progression, all the things you are walking straight down the scale to connect one chord root to the next, I'm going to run out of room very shortly, and it'll sound like this. I'm out of room, and I would have to jump back up. Right. So it takes a combination of ascending and descending lines and a very good control of this idea of ascending and descending lines to create decent stepwise walking lines. And this is not only limited to the scalar stepwise approach, it also applies equally well to the chordal approach. And this is where a lot of young players fall short. They learn formulas where their concept for playing a particular pattern or connection is stronger ascending than descending, and then get themselves into all kinds of problems in trying to connect a line that goes on for any length of time, because they do very well on one or the other, and then when they get to the other one they can kind of stumble a little bit and then mess up the groove or the time of what's going on. So in the next segment we're going to talk about the alternation of ascending and descending lines, and the concept of chunking when a bassist is thinking about how to make a connection in a song between chord roots, instead of having to think of every note, that they can think of bigger chunks of information. And so we'll be talking about systematic way of practicing and working through ascending and descending scalar lines by fourth. So once a player has taken the time to work these formulas out in the practice room and achieve some degree of mastery over controlling them and being able to produce them over any chord and any lead sheet and any progression, then the player is free to make decisions about bassline construction on a higher conceptual level, instead of thinking of every detail. So that instead of every ascending fourth line being root, ninth, flat third, major third, root, ninth, flat third, major third, which is a lot of thinking, or in the descending sense, instead of thinking root, seventh, sixth, fifth, root, seventh, sixth, fifth, which is a lot of thinking. Let's do the math there for a second and talk about, just sort of review how many thoughts a player has to have in order to play a line. If you're thinking of every note and you're playing all the things you are at quarter note equals 120, then that means if you're thinking of every note, that's 4 thoughts every 2 seconds. So you're going, right? If you're playing that at 240, if you're playing that song at quarter note equals 240, it means you're having 4 thoughts every second. And no one can really play very well thinking that much. It's got to be more ingrained and worked out in the practice room. And once that working out of these formulas has been done by the player, they are then free to control things on a much higher conceptual level. If I'm thinking of if I've mastered these formulas and now I'm thinking about not every detail of every note that I'm playing, but I'm just thinking, okay, I'm going to connect this ascending or descending, then that same, if I'm playing at 120, that 4 thoughts every 2 seconds becomes 1 thought every 2 seconds, which is far preferable, because all I'm thinking is I'm going to go up rather than I'm going to go up and it's going to be the root and the ninth and the flat third and the major third. It just means I'm thinking up. Or if I'm going down, instead of thinking root, seventh, sixth, but which sixth is it? I'm not really sure. Fifth, connecting to the next root, now I'm just thinking down. And at this point, what you're doing is actually chunking. You're connecting chunks of information together, which makes for a much more fluid line. And the player who is doing this kind of chunking of their lines, and having earned the right to do that by all the systematic practice that they've done, this player is now thinking in very simple terms. So they might be thinking of all the things you are in terms of simply the contour of the line. For each measure, they might think up or down. And so the line, instead of being all of those details which we visited just a minute ago, the line might consist of something more like the player's thought process being more along the lines of this. Up, up, down, 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 up, down, up, down, down, etc. So it might be just a matter of the player thinking one thought every bar instead of 4 thoughts per bar, and depending on the tempo of the tune, 4 thoughts per bar can be pretty daunting, if not impossible, to keep the time and the groove and the form together when you're thinking that much. So, and this concept of chunking applies not only to the scalar, linear, stepwise approach of line building, but also equally well to the chordal arpeggiated approach of line building, which we will visit in the next segment. So at this point, we've covered a lot of information. We have talked about the distances between chord roots. We've broken that distance down into 3 categories. Chord roots can be separated by the interval of a second, a third, or a fourth. We have talked about how fourths and fifths are inversionally related. We've talked about how to build scalar, linear, stepwise lines, both ascending and descending, and outlined a couple of formulas for those that are very common. And we've introduced the concept of chunking, wherein a player, instead of thinking of each individual note, they actually think of notes in groups at a time leading from place to place, so that they're exerting a more global sort of control over their line. And at this point, it's time to introduce the other really, really common way that bass players build bass lines, and that's by playing arpeggios, building lines out of arpeggios. The word arpeggio actually means broken chord, which is the actual translation of the word. And so when a bass player plays an arpeggio, what they're really doing is, remember, we're in the paradigm of 1 chord per bar for this video. So when a bass player plays an arpeggio, what they're doing is they're playing the root on beat 1, they're playing a chord tone on beat 2, another chord tone on beat 3, and then an approach tone to the next root on beat 4. For our purposes, we will define chord tones as root, third, fifth, and seventh. Now we may change this later as our lines get more advanced, but for now, 1, 3, 5, and 7. So what that means is there are a lot of different variations and permutations on how to build these arpeggiated bass lines, because we have 3 other chord tones besides the root to deal with and only 2 slots to put them in. So a player may choose to do the simplest thing and play root 3, 5 approach, root 3, 5 approach for the purposes of all the things you are. That would end up being something like this, to get from the F to the E flat. So F minor, B flat, or root 3, 5 approach, root 3, 5 approach, root. They may choose to play root 5, 3 approach, root 5, 3 approach, root 5, 3 approach, root 5, 3 approach, root. They may choose to include the 7th, so they may go root 5, 7 approach, so there's a lot of different variations that could happen in there. But the most common formula that is seen in jazz bass lines for the most part when doing an arpeggiated bass line is simply to arpeggiate the triad of the chord, root 3, 5 or root 5, 3. So for our purposes right now, we're going to focus on the root 3, 5 approach, just because it's so common and so effective, especially in cycle of fourth progressions, where ending up on the 5th right before the approach tone leads you a step away from where you need to go anyway. So it's actually very ergonomic and it makes a lot of musical sense. The first thing that we need to know when talking about ascending arpeggiated lines using this formula, or any formula that involves the third, is that unlike what we did when doing the scalar lines, ascending scalar lines by perfect fourth, the chord quality does matter. When we did the scalar lines, we ended up with a line that had both a minor third and a major third in it. So if we were playing F minor, we would end up playing F, G, A flat, A, and B flat. And because that line contained both the minor third and the major third, it could be used to cover a progression involving a minor chord, a dominant chord, or a major chord. When we're arpeggiating chords, we have to have a very specific knowledge of what the notes in that chord are. So we need to know that a minor chord is root, flat third, 5th, that a major chord, root, major third, and 5th, and that a dominant chord on that level is just like a major chord, root, major third, and 5th. So chord qualities matter. They did matter on the linear style as well, but they matter a lot more now, because if you play a wrong third, you're not going to get to offset it by playing the right one, even if that right one might be a chromatic passing tone. So to start with all the things you are, ascending lines, root 3, 5 approach, it would basically go like this. Root, root 3, 5 approach, root 3, 5 approach, root 3, 5 approach. And notice we're running into the same problem that we had with the ascending lines in the scalar section, which is you have to balance your ascending lines with your descending lines. Also realize that this formula is not as sacrosanct as the $1 million bass line was with the ascending lines. In other words, this formula, while it is very, very, very common, it's not quite as common as so there's a lot more variation in the arpeggiated bass lines than there is with the scalar ones. The scalar ones have a couple of formulas which are really more common than the others. So once we've learned to build all of these arpeggiated formulas, root 3, 5 and root 5, 3, I would say are probably the most common in an ascending fashion, we then need to build them in a descending fashion. And in building them in a descending fashion, it's a lot less ergonomic to play the descending version than it is to play the ascending version. So a lot of times I see with students, they're very good at playing these chords, root 3, 5, ascending. But when it comes time for them to play them descending, it becomes much more difficult and they tend to miss a lot more notes. And that's because the distance between the root and the third ascending is very, very close. It's a third, it's either a major or a minor third. But the distance between the root and the third when descending is much larger. It's either a major or a minor sixth. And for that reason, sometimes you cross strings. In fact, often you cross strings when you're trying to reach for that third. And so the third is a note which is either often missed when descending or played with very sketchy intonation when descending. So if I'm playing F minor, ascending, the arpeggio goes like this. But when I'm playing it descending, I'm reaching this interval, this very large major sixth, which is the inversion of the minor third. And so for each chord, what was a very simple pattern that fits in the hand and is almost always adjacent from string to string, root 3, 5, root 3, 5, root 3, 5, becomes a little bit more complicated. So here's F minor, B flat minor, E flat 7, A flat major, D flat major to G, and G to C. So the descending arpeggiated line is something which probably, if you think about, I'm going to designate a certain amount of practice time for each one of these things, for stepwise ascending, stepwise descending, stepwise ascending arpeggiated, and descending arpeggiated. This may be the place where you want to designate a little extra practice time to that, because it's just so physically awkward to play on the instrument compared to the ascending version. But like the stepwise versions of these formulas, it's important to have control of your ascending and your descending versions of these lines, so that, think again, the old adage, what goes up must come down. If you don't want your line to just run off one end of the bass or off the other end of the bass, and you want to be able to control the contour of the line in a very big picture way, you need to be able to do the same sort of chunking with the arpeggios that you did when you were playing the linear versions of these chord connections. So you may think something like this. Again, all the things you are. Up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, etc. And the opposite would be true. You might start on a down, you might go down, up, down, up, down, up. You might go up, up, down, up, up, down, up, down, up, down, etc. So it's important to have control over all of these elements. And then once you've mastered one of these formulas to the point where you can really do it almost automatically, even to the point where you say, okay, I can pretty much do this in my sleep, then that would be the time to add a new variation into the mix. If you have been playing root 3, 5 approach, and you get to the point where you can play root 3, 5 approach up, and you can play root 3, 5 approach down, and you can put a new lead sheet in front of yourself and pretty much read through it, basically chunking these formulas together, and start to sound like you've got starting to get a little bit of vocabulary together. Once you get to that point, that's the time in the practice room to say, okay, let me throw a new variation in. Let me work on the next change that I want to do. Let me now work on root 5, 3 approach, up and then down. And while you're not quite back to square one, you will have practiced a little bit of variation in expanding your vocabulary. And this, as I said in the previous video, this never ends. You're always going to be looking to add that new character or that new technique to your vocabulary, which will enable you to play even more freely and more intuitively in the moment as you construct your bass lines in the moment. In the next section, we are going to talk about mixing scalar and arpeggiated lines, and then also, before we end the video, talk about the idea of what a lot of bassists do when they encounter one chord which lasts longer than one bar. One chord, in this song, there are several places where one chord lasts 2 bars, and so we'll cover that scenario before we're finished as well. So at this point, we've covered a lot of information. Scalar lines ascending, scalar lines descending, chordal lines ascending, chordal lines descending, the idea of chunking patterns together rather than thinking of each individual detail. And in this section, we're going to talk about something which might well be called double chunking, which sounds kind of gross, but I think once it's explained, the point will come across well enough. It's the idea of saying, now we're going to combine the chordal and the scalar lines, ascending and descending, so that you, as a player, exert an even greater big picture control over what's going on without thinking of every detail, assuming the details have been worked out in the practice room. And I'm going to try and keep this section very short because the video is getting very long at this point, and I think that anyone who's made it this far will get the idea and see where some of these concepts could go if you took them to their logical extremes. So now we've got the first 8 bars of All the Things You Are, and we have 2 ways of outlining every chord, scalar linear versus chordal arpeggiated, and we have ascending and descending lines. And so we can stick with the idea of alternating these things rather than doing only one or the other. Remember, we did scalar up and down, and arpeggiated up and down. And now comes a time when we mix the two together, and now we'll say, you just basically pick a pattern type and a direction type, and you mix them together. So we can start by saying, now let's mix, let's just stay going up and coming down for now, although you realize that you can do all the permutations of up and down that you like, and eventually you do them on the fly. We're going to go up followed by down, up followed by down. So one way to start mixing these things over any chord progression, but for our purposes, All the Things You Are, would be to go arpeggiated up, scalar down, arpeggiated up, scalar down, etc., which would sound something like this. Excuse the bizarre fingering in that one. We might also go the opposite way and go scalar up, arpeggiated down, scalar up, arpeggiated down. Etc. And the possibilities when you do this sort of double chunking, you've got 2 different concepts and you have ascending and descending. The possible permutations for line variation in this type of system, while they are not actually endless, for practical purposes they are almost endless, because in the moment, one of the things that we as bassists like to do when constructing lines, first of all, we want to get to the point where we can make a line that actually makes sense, and get to the point where we're reading a chart or playing a chart from memory and be able to construct a line that outlines the changes and is clear to the other players on the bandstand, and that we establish a good time and groove. But we also, on that next level of playing that we're all headed towards, we want to not play the same line over and over and over again in the big picture sense. So that if you are playing, say you're playing at a jam session and you're playing All the Things You Are, and how many soloists are going to be playing on that tune, and how many choruses will each one take, we want to have the ability to weave subtle variations on our lines, so we don't play the exact same bass line over and over and over. And this kind of chunking and this mixture of linear and arpeggiated lines, ascending and descending, and then chunking all the permutations of those together, gives us the ability to do that on the fly. Even if we can't remember exactly what we played, sometimes you'll catch yourself playing something exactly the way that you played it on the previous chorus. And before the music even comes out, sometimes you'll find yourself thinking, You know, I don't want to do it exactly the same way as I did it last time. Last time I remember I went up. This time I'm going to go down, and now I'm going to see where that leads me. Sometimes that becomes a fork in the road that leads you into a new direction, and it's what keeps the music immediate and alive in the moment and keeps you engrossed, fully attentive and fully attuned to it, because you are kind of discovering your line as you go. You're gently directing it and then dealing with the consequences of where you directed it. So that idea of combining scalar and chordal lines, ascending and descending, is enough and has been enough for me for a long time to explore a lot of music in a lot of different ways, exploring variations on making that. And as time goes by, I've started introducing new variations into each of these concepts, variations on different target notes, what I call a target note, and etc. And so it goes on and on and on, and I'm quite sure I will never be finished. But since this video is getting very long, I'd like to close this section of that topic for now. And we have one more topic to cover before the conclusion of the video, and that is what we'll cover in the next segment, and it is what to do when you have one chord that lasts 2 bars. Well, we've covered a lot of material up to now about how to cover harmonic changes that move at the rate of 1 chord per bar. But in All the Things You Are, there are several places in the progression where 1 chord lasts 2 bars. And if we take the same formulaic approach to covering those 2 bars, we're going to end up with some repetition in our line. If you notice, the last 2 bars of the first A section of All the Things You are both, the harmony is C major for both bars. And if we take the same target approach, look at that way of outlining those changes and say, well, every bar that we do in 1 chord per bar is target something something approach, target something something approach, where that something may either be a scalar line or an arpeggio, then when we get to those 2 bars of C major, that approach will still work perfectly well. If I'm walking a scalar line from C and then I have 2 notes that connect to C, back to C, I would get something like this. C, walk, approach, C. So it would be target, target, target. Or if I were taking the arpeggiated approach, I might get root 3, 5, approach, root 3, 5, approach, to cover those 2 bars of C major. And that would work perfectly well. But if you want a little bit more variation than that, the best thing to do is not to abandon the entire target approach paradigm to covering these changes, but to simply change what you call a target note for the second measure. And this is something that we'll discover later in a later video on walking lines when we start to deal with the concept of modal lines. But the target still exists at the beginning of that second bar. It's just that you don't have to go root, root, root. You can change the target for the second measure. And so the most common thing that I hear bass players do on recordings who are still playing in that very specifically outlining kind of way, the most common thing I hear done is that they replace the target note of the second measure of a 2-bar section of the same harmony. They replace that second target with something other than the root. The most common thing that I hear on recordings is that the downbeat of that second bar, the target, instead of being the root of the harmony, will be the 5th of the harmony. And that's probably because the 5th is arguably, I guess, the second strongest and most stable note of the chord. So in this case, in All the Things You Are, when we get to that 2 measures of C major, instead of going C and then 2 notes leading to an approach note leading back to C, we'll lead into, instead of leading into the C on the downbeat of the second measure, we'll lead into the G, which is the 5th of that chord. And we can do that either walking, 5th, root, so again, root, approach, 5th, approach, root, or we could go down, root, approach, root, approach, root, and that will lead us with a very smooth connection. Or we could do the same thing arpeggiating. We could arpeggiate up, or we could arpeggiate down. And in this way, it gives us a little bit longer of a line between hearing roots all the time. And since we've already heard the root and the root isn't really changing for those two bars, simply exchanging the target note of the second bar when a harmonic rhythm is one chord for two bars, just changing that target note from the root to another chord tone. Could be the fifth, could be the third. In more advanced lines, it could be another chord tone as well. But just changing that target note gives you enough variation to make that particular part of the tune not seem so stuck to the root and make it seem like it's still flowing towards some other goal. Okay, this video has been very, very long, and for those of you who've made it this far, congratulations. We've covered a lot of material. Just to recap, we have covered distance between chord roots, seconds, thirds, and fourths. We have covered walking scalar, linear / stepwise lines to connect one chord root to the other. We've covered how to make them ascending, how to make them descending. We have covered the chordal or arpeggiated approach to connecting chord roots, and talked about different formulas for playing chordal lines ascending and descending. We have talked about the idea of chunking and alternating ascending and descending lines to control the contour of the line sort of from a greater distance, from a more global perspective. And then we covered the idea of mixing the scalar and chordal approaches to outlining the harmony, and what we called double chunking, and then mixing chordal and scalar approaches to the line to ascending and descending lines, and then discussed in a little bit of detail that there are a lot of permutations and a lot of exploration to do with just those devices in hand, just those tools in your toolbox. I'd like to conclude this installment, this episode, with a walking line on the same tune. In the intro, we had a very controlled, inside, standard sort of version of a walking line for All the Things You Are, which followed all of the rules set forth in this video. And it's a very conventional sounding line, very, very good melodic line. Everyone, if you play a line like that, everyone will know where you are at all times, and it's very clear. I'd like to conclude this episode with a playing example of a more modern approach to that line, where the target notes are sometimes substituted, and where the line is conceived of as more of just one big long melody that alludes to the changes rather than outlining everything all the time. Just as an example that, as I said in the very first walking lines video, the journey to learn to build walking bass lines never ends. You are never finished. You never get to the point where you say, I know everything about how to build a walking bass line. As I said in that video, bass lines are just melodies, and you never really finish learning how to create melodies. You just learn how to make different kinds of melodies, better melodies, variations on melodies. So to conclude this episode, I'll play a more modern version of a line for All the Things You Are. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you for future videos.